She was 18, alone in her apartment, just weeks into a new semester. 3 days later, she was found dead. No forced entry, no witnesses, no suspects. A pillow, a shirt, and silence. The DNA was there, blood, semen. But 20 years have passed, and no one has been arrested. So the question isn't just who killed Britney Phillips, it's how did he disappear, without ever leaving the room? The apartment was small, a second-floor unit in an aging complex on East 65th Street, Tulsa. From the outside, it looked like any other college rental: beige walls, a thin balcony, blinds slightly crooked. But on the inside, a silence had taken root. Not the ordinary stillness of an unoccupied room, but a dense, breathless quiet. The kind that only follows violence. When the door was finally opened, 3 days after 18-year-old Britney Phillips had last been heard from, what waited inside was not chaos. It was order interrupted. A blanket pulled halfway down the bed. A lamp still switched on. A single sock crumpled near the closet. But on the floor, beside the bed, lay her body, unmoving, half-covered, and cold. She was found lying on her back, her head tilted slightly to the right, eyes open just enough to suggest the final moments weren't quick. Her lips were parted. Skin pale, nearly blue. A long T-shirt clung to her frame, the only clothing she wore. The medical examiner would later note petechial hemorrhaging around her eyes, consistent with asphyxiation. There were no bruises around the neck, no ligature marks. The hyoid bone, typically fractured in manual strangulation, remained intact, yet there was no doubt she had been suffocated. The room offered no signs of forced entry. The front door was unlocked. The balcony door, though 2 floors above ground, was open just enough to allow air to move through. The windows were raised, and inside the closet, almost hidden, a panel had been pulled slightly ajar. A low wooden door leading into the building's attic crawlspace. This space, rarely mentioned in lease documents, connected at least 7 units in the complex. Anyone who knew it existed could move between apartments without ever stepping outside. The crime scene had all the makings of intimacy, yet none of the emotion. There were towels draped over her legs, items of clothing gathered nearby. It was arranged, but not gently, the kind of staging that doesn't come from guilt, but from calculation. Near the bed, semen was later identified on the sheets. In the kitchen, droplets of blood had dried near the sink. There were no signs of a struggle beyond her final breath. This wasn't a burglary. Nothing was taken. There was no forced entry, no broken windows. It wasn't impulsive. The method, the location, and the minimal noise all pointed to someone who had observed, waited, and acted with purpose, not for financial gain, but for control. In criminal psychology, suffocation without strangulation is often associated with offenders seeking dominance. The act is personal, close, and leaves little trace of itself, except for the stillness it forces upon its victim. It doesn't require strength. It requires resolve. And time. Britney didn't die in a rage. She died beneath silence. The apartment building itself was an accomplice. Its architecture allowed for invisibility. With no cameras monitoring the hallways and no record of who accessed the shared attic, any number of residents, or visitors, could have moved freely between the ceilings of other units and hers. The design flaw was not just structural, it was forensic. It erased pathways, confused timelines, and made every neighbor a potential suspect. From a criminal profile perspective, this was not the act of someone unfamiliar with the space. The killer either lived in the complex, had been inside before, or had learned the layout in detail. His ability to enter undetected, remain calm, execute the crime, and leave without a trace, all without arousing suspicion, places him in a very specific category. He is likely organized, quiet, socially functional. Not someone the neighbors would avoid, but someone they wouldn't remember. Britney Phillips was not chosen at random. Whether through observation, opportunity, or misplaced obsession, she became a target to someone who knew when she was alone, who understood the vulnerabilities of her apartment, and who felt entitled to take her breath without ever raising his voice. The scene was more than just a place where death occurred. It was a reflection of the killer's mind, controlled, cold, and hauntingly efficient. And within it lay the first clues that would later send investigators down the wrong path, not because the evidence was misleading, but because it was too clean. The silence in that apartment didn't begin with her last breath. It began long before that, the moment someone decided to watch, wait, and end the life of a young woman who trusted her world to be safe. If you're ready, I'll move on to part 2, where we'll follow the trail of DNA that promised answers, but delivered only shadows. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us a lot. Thank you. At first, it seemed like the investigation had caught a break. In cases like this, where no one heard screams and nothing appeared stolen, forensic evidence becomes the most reliable witness. The blood near the sink, the semen on the bed, the presence of DNA, uninvited, silent, but undeniable. It held the promise of resolution. The forensic lab moved quickly. Samples were collected, cataloged, and processed. Within weeks, results returned. 2 distinct profiles stood out, both belonging to the same man. One from the semen, the other from the blood. In theory, this should have narrowed the list of suspects to one, a single match, and the case could have pivoted from mystery to arrest. But the reality was less satisfying. The DNA belonged to someone who willingly came forward. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't unknown. He was the boyfriend of one of Britney's close friends. His explanation was disarming in its simplicity. He claimed to have visited the apartment weeks earlier when Britney had allowed his girlfriend to stay over. They had, he admitted, used Britney's bed. As for the blood, he blamed a nosebleed. And on paper, his timeline held. Investigators verified his alibi. The girlfriend confirmed his story. There were no inconsistencies, no gaps wide enough to crack. It was inconvenient, but not impossible. The DNA, it seemed, had spoken too soon. It didn't belong to the killer, at least not the one they were looking for. Still, something about the situation felt unfinished. The DNA was real. It was found where a murder took place. Yet it led to a dead end. Cases like this, where the science is definitive but the interpretation is flawed, are among the most dangerous. They create illusions of progress. They tempt detectives to stop digging. But buried within the case file, far below the pages of lab results and property maps, was a smaller, almost forgotten piece of evidence. Material scraped from under Britney's fingernails during the autopsy. A trace amount. Enough to suggest she had struggled, fought back, maybe reached for a face, or clawed at a hand pressing down. That DNA was never tested. Not then. Not during the first wave of lab work. Investigators had placed their faith in the semen and the blood. They believed it was enough. Testing everything, they said, would take time, would cost money. So the fingernail samples waited, untouched, unprocessed, ignored. To a forensic profiler, that oversight speaks volumes. It reveals how quickly assumptions can shape an investigation, how easily the presence of DNA becomes a substitute for context. Yet the truth rarely aligns so neatly. Killers don't leave calling cards, they leave confusion. The profile of this killer, as it begins to emerge, is not of someone chaotic or disorganized. This was not a frenzied attack. There was no overkill, no post-mortem ritual. What's visible instead is a method, a decision to silence, a comfort with proximity, and an exit that was as silent as the approach. He likely didn't panic. There are no signs of rushing, no overturned furniture. He didn't linger. He left with the same composure he entered with, the kind of control seen in offenders who rehearse their crimes in thought long before they commit them in reality. And still, the strongest evidence remained dormant, a silent testimony under fingernails waiting to speak. It wouldn't be until many years later, under public pressure and the persistence of Britney's mother, that the samples would finally be tested, sent to a lab with the tools and time to decode what may be the last untapped clue. A chance, perhaps the last one, to place the killer inside that apartment, not through guesswork or confession, but through the genetic fingerprints no one can outrun. The question remains, if the killer didn't bleed and didn't leave his seed, what exactly did he leave behind? In the next part, the narrative shifts from evidence to endurance. A mother who refused to let her daughter's name fade, and a system forced to look inward to confront what it chose to overlook. When you're ready, I'll continue with part 3. Long after the apartment had been cleaned, after the officers packed up their case folders and the media found other stories to chase, one person stayed behind. Not in that physical space, but in the silence it left behind. Maggie Zingman, psychologist, prison counselor, and mother, did not go back to her life. She began another one. Not one she chose. One shaped entirely by the loss of her daughter. There's a particular weight that follows a parent who knows their child was murdered, but who is told, again and again, that there are no answers. For Maggie, that absence became a purpose. She started traveling from state to state, across thousands of miles, in a car wrapped in pink and purple, Britney's favorite colors, covered in her daughter's photo. She called it the caravan to catch a killer. But it wasn't a spectacle. It was a warning, a message to every town she passed through that the killer had not been caught, and that someone, somewhere, might know more than they realize. Maggie did what departments could not, or would not. She engaged the public. She spoke to news outlets, investigators, strangers. She learned the language of DNA testing, of familial searching, of funding gaps in state forensic programs. She carried not only grief, but knowledge. And in 2018, that persistence brought her to the doors of Parabon Nanolabs. They took the DNA collected at the scene, specifically the semen, and used it to construct a snapshot, a digital rendering, the face of a man who had never been photographed, but whose genes told a story. White, fair skin, likely blue or green eyes, sandy blonde or light brown hair. In the composite he looked young, calm, ordinary. That image was released to the public, but instead of a lead, it led to a contradiction. A man came forward. He looked like the sketch. He matched the DNA, and he admitted to being in Britney's apartment. But not during the murder. According to him, it was weeks earlier. A sexual encounter with his girlfriend in Britney's bed. He had bled slightly. A nosebleed, nothing more. Investigators confirmed the story. And just like that, the face Maggie hoped would bring justice became another dead end. But she didn't stop. She asked the question no one else would. What about the DNA under Britney's fingernails? Why had that not been tested? If the face on the screen wasn't the killer, then who was? The lab work began, finally, years late. The sample was small, contaminated perhaps, but still viable. And in that fragment of flesh, scraped by a desperate girl fighting for air, may lie the truth. Not as it was imagined, but as it occurred. Behind closed doors, the Tulsa Police Department resisted outside help. Offers from cold case organizations were quietly declined. Requests for collaboration were redirected. They had done their job, they insisted. The case was active, but not open, and certainly not shared. Still, the walls were cracking. Public attention, renewed by Maggie's campaign, forced a response. The department allowed the DNA to be analyzed by advanced labs, not willingly perhaps, but inevitably. And so the question returned. If the killer didn't leave behind semen, if he didn't bleed, if he had no reason to be there, no connection to the scene, then the only place he could have left his trace was in the grip of a girl who refused to die quietly. The narrative is no longer just about Britney. It is about how systems fail, how assumptions take root, and how a mother's grief can become more precise than any scalpel in the hands of forensics. Maggie is still on the road. Her voice is quieter now, her hair more silver. But her purpose hasn't faded. Every time the caravan moves forward, every time someone new hears Britney's name, the killer's silence becomes less certain. There are few truths in this world as haunting as the knowledge that someone has gotten away with murder. But there are fewer still as powerful as the persistence of memory, and the determination to speak the names others have chosen to forget. Britney's story does not end in that apartment. It lives in every test result, in every email unanswered, in every mile driven by a mother who refuses to turn around. Justice hasn't arrived, but neither has surrender, and that, more than anything, is why this case is not cold. It is waiting, watching, just like he did.